and a good, unambiguous example of wisdom in a text that could not have been a product of its contemporary cultures. In other words, I want to see I would like, I don't demand this, it would be nice though, to see something in a holy text that is clearly not a product of an ignorant, superstitious culture that's missing something. And it would be great to see something that actually tells us something that the people writing it at the time could not have known, but would eventually be discovered to be true. And it should have a good track record on these things. If it makes 1,000 predictions, and one of them happens to hit the mark, and the rest are all baloney, that's not persuasive. And if you have to do mental gymnastics, or play with semantic word games, like the whole thing with iron in the Quran, see, I used a non-Christian example. That's it's not persuasive. You got to play around with the words to make it fit. Reliable miracles that are above reproach. Things that are not speaking in tongues or faith healing. Things that, I mean, if God's going to do miracles at all, and again, Scripture tells us that miracles exist for the purpose of being persuasive, then why would He do them in a way that would look hokey? There should either be no miracles whatsoever, or exclusively miracles that are a true spectacle and very persuasive. You talk about how you don't listen to William Lane Craig, Pat Robertson, Rick Warren, and you list the names of some folks that you do listen to. Okay, for the sake of clarification, when I named those guys off, I wasn't necessarily thinking that you personally listened to them. What I was just getting at is that if such and such thing were to be revealed to us, it would be revealed by these characters who are specifically in a position to know. And what I was talking about, for example, if quantum theory actually gave us a good reason to believe in God, then I would expect to hear Neil deGrasse Tyson or Stephen Hawking or someone else maybe tell us so. I wouldn't take anyone else's theories about it seriously. Now, you talk about Ken Miller. I remember his name, and it's funny, I just happened to have made a reference to him in the annotations of an earlier video I made responding to someone who responded to my response to you. So much responding going on. But anyway, I'm sure you can find that video. It's not important to this conversation. I was familiar with Ken Miller. I don't have any real problem with Ken Miller. He seems like if all Christians were Ken Miller, I wouldn't go to nearly as much trouble as I do arguing against it. I would be more than happy to sit and have quiet, respectful conversations over applesauce and champagne. But you ask, why is their scientific opinion any less valid than Richard Dawkins or Stephen Hawking or anyone else? And I think maybe a good word that you were looking for when you said valid might have been persuasive. Maybe not. You can let me know. Why? Okay. Well, there's a two-part answer. One for Stephen Hawking and another one for everyone else. I want to... And the only reason I mentioned Stephen Hawking separately is because of this point about science. You make a point about Ken Miller being very scientifically minded, and he is. He is a scientist. He's a very educated man, and he knows his science. I acknowledge that. Let me just get into it. Stephen Hawking, when he talks about things relevant to this topic, when he talked, for example, about the existence of God, he was doing that some of the times, not all of the time, but some of the time in sort of a pure science, peer-reviewed sort of context. In other words, he's, to borrow a phrase from the Catholics, and kind of thrust the square peg into the round hole of the science world, speaking from the chair. He's speaking as a scientist, sort of to scientists in a scientific way with published, peer-reviewed sort of research. I don't know how much that applies to the different things he says, but I know that his general explanation of the ex nihilo possibility is that sort of thing. When he specifically says the universe does not need God, I kind of doubt that was in a peer-reviewed paper, but A, I wouldn't totally rule it out, and B, even if it's not as such, the ideas from which he said that were. Now, as for everyone else, that includes Richard Dawkins, I would add Daniel Dennett would be a good person to add to that. As compared to Ken Miller and everyone else, Richard Dawkins is arguing from within a scientific context against the existence of God. Excuse me. Admittedly, Ken Miller and others like him are doing the same thing in favor of God. Here's the difference. Where Ken Miller and Lee Strobel, for example, and others like them, there seemed to be sort of a rearguard, ad hoc defense of the faith against the perceived encroachment of science. In other words, they're saying, here's why it's still okay to believe in God. Not necessarily, here is why you actively should believe in God. It's more of like a, here's why, here's an excuse to keep believing. It seems kind of like it would be unkind to use the word desperate, and that's not what I'm trying to say. But it seems much less persuasive. Richard Dawkins, Dennett, and others like them, on the other hand, and I should just say Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett because you might make assumptions about who else I would lump in them. So let's just say those two. Let's just keep it confined to those two. They're more avant-garde, not artistically, but sort of semantically, where Lee Strobel and Ken Miller are rearguard, they're avant-garde. They're pushing the line forward. Their line is moving forward. Ken Miller's line is retreating. Not necessarily numerically. I'm not talking about who they're convincing. I'm talking about conceptually. If you actually look at the arguments taking place, one side is clearly giving ground. The other side is gaining ground. And the idea of the existence of God is like the flag on the battlefield for the pro-God side, and the flagpole is still standing. It's still within the area that they're holding. It's still on the ground they're camping. In other words, it's still possible to believe in God while being educated. But that line is receding. It's getting pushed back. It's not clear if it will ever be pushed back. In fact, it probably won't ever be pushed back to the point where the flag is no longer protected, just because it's so impossible to prove a negative. But make no mistake, that line is in retreat. And here's why, I believe. Richard Dawkins and Daniel Dennett are offering good explanations for the existence of religion itself. And those alternative explanations do not assume the truth of religion. And furthermore, those alternative explanations are preferred by the concept of Occam's razor. In other words, when I look at Daniel Dennett's explanation of religion functioning from an evolutionary point of view, not as an adaptation of man, but almost like a parasite, and that sounds really insulting. You'd have to read his work on it. I promise you, it's not meant to be insulting. It just really happens to be a great analogy for what he's trying to get across. In other words, religious belief evolves by the same sorts of processes as a microorganism or a parasite does. It takes advantage of certain weaknesses that we have and perpetuates itself. You have to read him on it. I think I might have a good video that talks about that somewhere that I could post if I could find it. And basically, speaking for myself, and I know there are other atheist skeptics who feel the same way that I do, although not all atheists are necessarily this high-minded. We're not monolithic. It's not that we dismiss Ken Miller and other people like him out of bias. Rather, we simply find Dawkins and Dennett more persuasive on the points. You get into a little bit personal journey versus personal choice. Now, it does sound like in your case, as you explained it, it may have been something like a choice. You talk about being a period in your life when you were an agnostic and you didn't care if there was a God or not. Okay, fair enough. From that point of view, I could easily see someone choosing to pick a side. But just because there's a personal journey, just because you might change your mind, does not necessarily follow that at any particular point you made a choice to change your mind. Figuring for myself, I went through 2 periods of conversion, one from Anglicanism to Catholicism, and one from Catholicism to atheism. And you could make the argument that I went to agnostic deism in between Catholicism and atheism, but it was sort of desperately clinging at a straw. It wasn't really a firmly held conviction at all. It didn't last long at all. And in both cases, I can tell you, I did not feel that I was making a choice. I felt in both cases, fought against it. When I became Catholic, I was leaving the faith I'd been brought up in. There were some sort of consequences for leaving it. Not serious consequences. I wasn't going to be disowned by my parents, but I wanted to have been right. I was looking to prove myself right, not the Catholics. And I didn't want to have to deal with explaining to my parents that I changed my faith. I wasn't looking to change, but looking at it this was from a theological point of view, couldn't argue with Catholicism from the point of view of an Anglican. It had the better arguments, and I was powerless to change my mind. Likewise, when it went from Catholicism to atheism, I was powerless in the face of the evidence and the arguments to change my mind. I got some comments on my last video to you about my example with the fingers on the hand. And some ideas that they had were you could pay someone to hypnotize you, or you could try to hypnotize yourself to believe that I had 7 fingers. Yes, I admit in that sense you could choose to try and encourage a particular belief in yourself, but ultimately those efforts can and often do fail. And the belief itself, I maintain, is not a choice, much of the time. To be honest, though, I'm not sure what difference this makes to our debate, so if you don't want to worry over much about deciding whether it's a choice or not, we can always worry about that when it seems more important. That's all I have for now. This is definitely going to be another 2-parter. I'm sorry about that. I hate making you watch nearly a half an hour of video. But I want to do a fair job of responding to the very thoughtful video that you sent. So I hope that you're not too bored reading it, and maybe I'll turn you on to champagne and applesauce too. Have a good night. Bye.